candidate Trump promised tax cuts. President Trump is trying to follow through on that promise. Today, we hear two reactions to a proposal that the administration is calling the largest tax cut in U.S. history. First up, 19th Congressional District Representative Republican John Faso. It's great to speak with you. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Susan. Great to be with you again.
So acknowledging that we're a little light on details at this point, what are your thoughts on the outline of the tax proposal?
Well, we are a little light on details, but I do think that the president is looking for making a big impact here. He wants to get the economy going, and one of the ways to do that is to finally fix the complexity of the tax code, but also a deal for individuals, but also deal with the need to lower corporate tax rates to keep our companies competitive internationally. Where we wind up in this process is another question. It's another story. There's going to be a lot of people weighing in, and I do think that this is an area where we can get some bipartisan cooperation as well, because I think there are a lot of Democrats that want to have an impact on this legislation.
The last time we spoke, you articulated serious concerns about the national debt. Do you believe that we need a way to pay for the cuts, these proposed cuts, or do you subscribe to the Treasury Secretary's theory that the cuts will pay for themselves?
Well, I don't entirely subscribe to that, but I do think that greater economic growth is something that will create more tax revenue for the government. But I don't know that, for instance, moving the corporate rate down to 15% will make sense from a budgetary standpoint. I also serve on the Budget Committee, as you know, and we are looking at a 10-year stretch where the projected national debt is going to go from 19 trillion to 29 trillion, and that's with a T, trillion. So these numbers are almost incomprehensible.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's hard to wrap your mind around something like that.
It totally is. And so it's even hard to write because it's a lot of zeros. But the fact is that I do think tax cuts properly implemented and designed will spur more economic activity and hence more revenue. But there's a limit to that equation.
Yeah.
And so I'm not one of those that believes that the tax reductions in and of itself can, quote unquote, pay for themselves. So I think you've really got to. We have to look at this very, very carefully to make sure that we're still leaving we're spurring economic growth, but not totally eviscerating the revenue sources of the government. Because, as you know, we have spending needs for infrastructure and for other programs in the government.
And it could shoot us in the foot if we don't fund all of that.
Yes.
With something. Yeah. What about, I know the border adjusted tax is reportedly off the table, but then again, so is the Obamacare reform. Did you support the border adjusted tax?
I never took a public position on it other than to say that I was skeptical of it. And there was, look, if you're an American exporter, if you're General Electric or you're Caterpillar or you're Boeing, the border adjustment made a lot of sense. But if you're a retailer, or I have a baker in our district who imports his organic wheat from France, there are so many unintended consequences here, and I want to see a situation where we're not penalizing those that are doing important business internationally. I talked to a number of smaller manufacturers who import critical components for their manufacturing process from abroad. And so the more I studied the border adjustment, the more skeptical I became that it would not have a number of unintended consequences rippling through the economy that would be negative. Now, be that as it may, I do think that there's an awful lot that's going to happen between now and whenever we get something enacted.
Sure.
And again, I hope that we can work this out on a bipartisan basis so that we minimize the discord and actually get something done that's productive for the American people and our economy.
So here's an idea that a lot of people have described as being out there or crazy, but it's one that is supported by people on both sides of the political spectrum, some people anyway, and that is using a carbon tax to pay for this.
Yeah, I think, look, there are proponents about the carbon tax. I have been skeptical about that because of the way in which they were proposing to utilize the proceeds and how they would distribute them.
Are you talking about the Schultz, Baker, Paulson?
Yes, exactly.
And you, just so my listeners understand, this would be a tax on each ton of carbon, I think, emissions, and then we would get the money. Americans would get the money back with a quarterly check.
Right, and that there's the rub. I mean, how you distribute the money was problematic to me because someone who's living in the city, for instance, who uses public transportation would have a much less carbon footprint, and therefore than someone who has to drive 50 miles to and from work upstate, or a farmer who's using 4 or 5 diesel tractors in his operation, or a trucking firm that might have 20 or 30 trucks. They're a much heavier user of carbon. So a notion that you were going to reimburse people on an equal basis, regardless of their actual carbon footprint, didn't make any sense to me. So I do think that it's not a crazy idea from the standpoint of there are many economists will say that if you want to reduce CO2 emissions, you have to put a price on carbon per se. On the other hand, the fact is we are greatly reducing CO2 emissions in the U.S. In fact, in New York and the U.S. we've reduced CO2 by 20 to 25% in the last 20 or so years, mainly because we've switched to renewables, but also because we've used natural gas to substitute for coal with electric generation. So that's been the big driver reducing CO2 emissions here in the U.S.
If we're not going to use let's just put a carbon tax off to the side for a second.
Sure.
And the border adjustment tax, you say you're skeptical of. What would be a way that you would support to pay for something like this?
Well, again, I think if you close some loopholes and deductions, it only takes you so far because if, the 3 big loopholes, if you will, and deductions are the mortgage interest deduction,
which they're floating.
Yeah,
but people love that.
People love that. The second thing is the exemption from taxation for employer-provided health care. And most Americans who receive employer-provided health care don't even realize they're getting a big tax break with that. And the third one is the exemption from federal taxation for state and local taxes. So our state income tax and local property taxes, which people are able to deduct from their taxes. That one is actually in jeopardy because there are many states, lower tax states than New York and California and New Jersey, for instance, and Connecticut. There are representatives from those lower tax states who think, why are we allowing the federal treasury to, quote unquote, subsidize the high spending states like New York,
like ours, right?
Like New York. And I respond, this is a matter of federalism, and you shouldn't subject this income to a double taxation, if you will, and exempting from federal taxation, allowing a deduction for the amount that you and I pay in property taxes and state income taxes is something that is also strongly supported in New York, and it would be really a big tax hit on people in our state. So those are the 3 big ones, and it's very hard to get to an equivalency in terms of economic equivalency of the value of the tax cut when you are just simply closing loopholes.
Yeah, these are all 3 not very.
No,
they're going to be distasteful to a lot of people.
You can see the problem there. Now, some say, well, we should only allow a deduction for home mortgage interest on your primary residence and only up to a certain amount. That also presents a number of problems, both logistical and political, and I've not been supportive of that. So for anything, it's like the old expression that Russell Long, when he was the chairman of the Finance Committee 35 or 40 years ago, he said the thing he heard the most is don't tax you, don't tax me, tax the fellow behind the tree. So that's really what most people view as fair taxation, as long as it doesn't affect me or you,
of course.
And it only affects the other guy. So that's the problem that Congress is going to have, is that every one of these deductions and exemptions has an interest that is out there to defend it.
We have a couple more minutes. It seems like there's a lot on Congress's plate. I mean, you're still working on this repeal of Obamacare, I've read. Then there's this new tax proposal. There's the stopping of a possible government shutdown. And
well, let me tell you this.
Yeah.
I think it's just about a certainty that there won't be a government shutdown. I think there's a bipartisan consensus that would not make sense, and it would be very harmful to the country. So I know the appropriators are working hard to get a consensus. It's a bipartisan effort. It has to be because you have to get 60 votes in the Senate to pass these appropriations measures. So I know that House and Senate Democrats and Republicans are working on this issue with the White House to try to make sure that we if we don't get the extension through the rest of the fiscal year done by Friday, I anticipate a short-term extension, and then next week passing an appropriation that will carry us through the rest of the fiscal year.
There is this 100-day sort of fake deadline that some in the media are talking about, and there is a concern that Congress is going to try to get all this done by Friday or Saturday. I mean, it's a ridiculous notion.
It is ridiculous, and since you called it fake, I'm not sure we should even talk about it.
Okay, all right. So I'm glad to hear you say that. Yeah. We're actually out of time, and I know you're due on the floor. I want to thank you so much, 19th Congressional District Representative John Faso. What a pleasure.
Thank you, Susan.
This program is presented by WCNY Syracuse.